January 1945. The Allies are advancing on all fronts. The Nazi regime seems on the brink of collapse.
On the Western Front, the last major German offensive had just failed. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched a major offensive and is moving towards Berlin. And with the air war is totally lost for the Germans.
Yet one man refuses to accept that the Third Reich is over: Adolf Hitler. He has such faith in Nazi power that he continues planning to build a brand new capital city for his empire.
Hitler increasingly took refuge in fantasy plans for rebuilding Berlin with vast buildings.
Hitler was a sucker for anything that was big. I'm going to build you the Volkssturm, which is going to sort of, seat 180,000 people. Hitler loves all that stuff.
Hitler convinces the German people that victory is still possible with his sinister vengeance weapons.
One of the ways you still got solidarity in the fighting spirit is that you promised the German people that a new generation of miracle weapons would fight the war for them.
Nazi propaganda has such power that Germans fight for Hitler right up to the end.
I mean, these people don't stop fighting even when the Russians are in the garden of the Reich Chancellery.
Even children join up to defend Berlin. They are told that German design and engineering brilliance will defeat the Allies despite their enormous resources, but reality is crushing this illusion.
Half of all of Germany's dead in the Second World War occurred in the last 10 months of the war. I mean, this is a bloodbath without parallel in European and perhaps in human history.
Hitler claims Germany leads the world in design and technology. Now, the world is putting that claim to its ultimate test. June 1944, just days after D-Day. British and American forces are spreading across France, flushed with success, but their advance is about to be stopped by one man and one tank. The man is Michael Wittmann, a German panzer ace. He's already credited with destroying over 100 enemy tanks. His weapon is the much-feared Tiger, the most powerful German tank on the battlefield.
The Tiger tank certainly had two positive attributes. It was heavily armored and it had a very powerful gun. And this allowed the Tiger tank to fight against Allied tanks at a range when the Allies tanks were not able to knock out the Tiger tank. So they often could keep the enemy tanks at a distance.
The British 7th Armoured Division advances from the Normandy beaches to the small French town of Villers-Bocage. They are greeted by cheering French civilians. The British soldiers are relaxed. In the morning, Michael Wittmann and his men strike.
They realised that there are lots of British troops and tanks in the village, all kind of, just waking up and yawning and stretching and making their cups of tea. And Wittmann, who is the commander of this company, thinks, here's a golden opportunity here, and splits into two. And he goes off on his own pretty much and careers around a road that is parallel to the main drag in Villers-Bocage, in which all these British tanks and units and carriers are waiting. And goes down this parallel road, and wherever there's a link, he turns his barrel to the right and fires and blows them all up, and then actually moves into the main high street himself and finishes off the job.
In less than 15 minutes, at least 13 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 other vehicles are destroyed by Wittmann and his men. For many Germans, the Battle of Villers-Bocage proves that their tanks and soldiers are inherently superior to the Allies. German propaganda describes Wittmann as a noble hero for a country which desperately needs one. He's promoted to captain and awarded one of Germany's highest honours, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords, by Hitler himself.
These events were massively played up by German propaganda, and it's very interesting that the cult of the ace was something that was absolutely integral to the German propaganda machine. And a lot of these people were kind of put on pedestals, whether they be U-boat aces, whether they be fighter aces, whether they be dive bombing aces, or whether they be panzer aces. And it is amazing how often these aces tended to be incredibly good looking. They're all absolutely conformed to the ideal of the Aryan kind of superhero in a way that the Nazi leadership itself didn't. And Wittmann was no different.
But despite Wittmann's success, neither he nor any other Tiger commander prevents the Allied breakout from Normandy.
Really, all we're talking about here is a minor tactical engagement. The British didn't have much chance of exploiting that gap at the time anyway. Did it have an overall effect on the campaign? No. How significant were the losses? Well, actually, by the time the two-day battle was all over, and it wasn't just that morning engagement, the Germans had only marginally fewer casualties than the British did, and 6 of their precious Tiger tanks had been knocked out.
German propaganda exaggerates Wittmann's achievement. The German Armed Forces magazine, Signal, shows the aftermath of the battle but uses 3 different photographs joined together, creating a false impression of the destruction. And the Tiger tank is not the war-winning weapon the Nazis claim it is.
First, it was too slow, so that made it very difficult for the Tiger tank to advance quickly or withdraw quickly. Second, it was too heavy, so this meant certain bridges were not passable. Third, it was not motorized enough, it was under-motorized, so too slow and too difficult to maneuver. And fourth, as it was too heavy, the fuel consumption was also far too high, and that was something Germany could not afford in 1944 with the scarcity of its resources.
The Tiger is rushed into production. Early Tigers are particularly unreliable. They often break down during combat and have to be abandoned. In fact, more Tigers are destroyed by their crews than by the enemy. And it costs far too much money, resources and labour to produce. Only about 1,350 Tigers are built during the war, compared with 6,300 of the less glamorous Panther.
Generally, I would say that the Panther tank was superior to the Tiger tank. It had similar strengths, like strong armor and a powerful gun, but it was much more reliable and it was also more maneuverable. So it would be logical if the Germans had focused solely on the Panther tank and not on the Tiger tank. However, this would mean not to understand the nature of the Nazi regime and the Nazi state.
The problem is, Hitler believes only conflict and competition get results.
People misunderstand the nature of the Nazi state. The image we're kind of given is this ruthlessly efficient state in which people are told exactly what to do. Actually, Hitler created a chaotic state. He set up agencies against each other. He got them to compete and look to him for authority.
That's all a byproduct of Hitler's method of rule, which was not to centralize and coordinate everything, but to appoint different people, institutions to do the same thing and let them fight it out amongst themselves, and whichever was the most ruthless, he thought, would be the best and come out on top.
In the end, this meant a waste of resources because every company tried to produce its own tank, or first to conceive it and later to produce it. And so the Germans were unable to streamline their resources.
This infighting means Germany cannot produce enough of its best weapons for all its troops. But as for the quality of the soldiers themselves, Germany leads the world.
The German army has often been portrayed as the most skillful and the most efficient army of the Second World War. They knew how to deploy their arms in a so-called combined arms approach. So the cooperation between infantry, artillery, tanks, and also the Air Force was generally pretty good. Second, the German army was generally well led. So officers and NCOs looked generally well after their men, and all this formed a glue for high combat motivation. And many believed, perhaps not in Nazism as such, but many of them believed in the Führer and the Reichschancellor Adolf Hitler as their great leader.
The skill, bravery and loyalty of the German military is constantly shown in German cinemas as part of the propaganda newsreels known as the Weekly Review, the Wochenschau.
It was a link between the millions of German soldiers who were at the front to their families back home, and their families then had an idea of what their achievements were. Because the Wochenschau films were all about achievement. How much ground has been taken, how many enemy vehicles have been destroyed, and all this was good for the soldiers' morale, because then their loved ones back home were truly appreciative of what was being achieved for them at the front. You do get images of wounded soldiers, rarely many dead soldiers, for obvious reasons. And that really was the success of the Wochenschau, because there was sufficient truth in there, grainy realism, to enhance the value of the propaganda. I think because much of it is actuality footage, it's got that grainy feel that contemporary newsreels have. They're obviously unrehearsed, not all, but many of them are unrehearsed and showing combat as it really is, because some of the sound effects are there.
Keeping up civilian morale is vital for the Nazis. They're convinced that, in the First World War, the German army was not defeated. Instead, they believe it was the home front that collapsed. They're determined to stop that from happening again.
Privations faced by German families during the Second World War were not as bad as you might have expected for the first few years of the war, because Goebbels was immensely aware of the fact that many people felt that the First World War had been lost by Germans due to insufficient rations towards the end of the war. So Goebbels was really keen to make sure that the home front was well provided for as long as possible.
In the beginning, stunning military successes convince the people that Hitler is a great war leader. Poland is captured in 5 weeks, France in little more than 6. But Hitler's ongoing lust for territory is undermining his popularity.
People's views of the Nazis weren't static over time. When Germany was winning lots of victories early on, that was sort of easy propaganda for Hitler, and I guess people were keen to throw their weight behind the national cause out of patriotism, even if they had had reservations about Hitler. But as the war went on, and there were more personal costs associated with the war, with men away fighting, rationing, biting harder after the defeat at Stalingrad in '43, the popularity of the regime began to wane significantly, because the difference between propaganda and reality became ever starker.
What you can't make successful propaganda out of is failure. And this is, I think, the reason why the propaganda efforts from particularly 1943 onwards are less and less successful.
When Hitler decides to invade Russia, he triggers a series of events which will destroy his military.
The Blitzkrieg really ran out of steam in Russia. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, this was his best armed and strongest foe to date. And the major change immediately was, once they crossed the frontier, the tempo of the fighting was immediately very high. That in time led to obviously extremely heavy casualties, so that by, let's say, October 1941, the army that invaded Russia had had casualties to the equivalent of 30 divisions. And in terms of leadership, they had lost by that time the equivalent of 37 divisions worth of junior officers and NCOs. as the new guys are promoted, they are the people that have been schooled in National Socialism. So the, if you like, the social fabric and psychology of the army underwent quite profound changes in 1941 to 42.
Nazi society and the Nazi state was very much a militarized state. When a young soldier entered the German army as a young recruit, he had already went through various Nazi party organizations. And research has also shown that the most Nazified soldiers within the Wehrmacht were the younger ones. So the younger German soldier was, the more likely it was he was Nazified.
Despite their inexperience, Hitler benefits from the loyalty of these young soldiers. Since he became Führer in 1934, everyone has sworn an oath to serve him personally. In the past, German soldiers pledged themselves to the state, but Hitler has changed all that.
The oath to Hitler was very crucial for the army's loyalty to Hitler. For instance, for the officers, and particularly those who were critical towards the Nazis and Hitler. For them, it always posed a big barrier because breaking the oath was out of question. From then on, an individual soldier was no longer bound to the state, but to one person, Hitler himself.
Obedience, accepting orders without question, is central to the Nazi project. But no matter how loyal they are, the influx of dedicated Nazi soldiers cannot change the fact that by the summer of 1943, the war is going badly for Germany.
On the Eastern Front, the major offensive at Kursk had failed. The initiative now lay solely with the Soviets. Over the skies of Germany, the Allied bombing campaign intensified more and more. In North Africa, Army Group Africa had just surrendered and the Allies were preparing to launch their offensive against Fortress Europe. And finally, in the Atlantic, the U-boats had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The senior leadership of the German army and the German armed forces saw that the war was against them and there was no question anymore of winning the war. However, they still continued. They still waged the war as if there was still a chance to win the war.
Despite Nazi propaganda, the severity of the situation can no longer be hidden from civilians.
Women were dealing with bombing, rationing, possibly having their children evacuated and being worried about their relatives, husbands, fathers, brothers at the front. But as the war began to bite and began to be felt more intrusively in people's lives, their attitudes towards the regime, to the fact that maybe the Nazi fat cats weren't feeling the same privations as ordinary people were, that maybe middle and upper class women, for example, weren't making such a contribution to the war effort in the way that working class women were, that they were somehow able to kind of shirk their duties and get a cushier job or role. All of these things didn't go unnoticed and caused a lot of acrimony, and it caused the regime to lose a lot of popularity.
British and American bombers are inflicting terrible damage on German cities.
The lack of availability of food, the long queuing, all of which was made much worse by bombing and the fact that water pipes were broken, so people had to go and get their waters in buckets from wells. Daily life was completely disrupted, particularly in the major cities, as a result of the bombing and the rationing combined.
Hitler refuses to visit bomb-damaged cities, but he can't avoid seeing the devastation of Berlin, yet he shows little concern. The destruction actually makes it easier for him to imagine his grandiose plans to totally transform the capital.
Well, Hitler increasingly took refuge in fantasy plans for rebuilding Berlin, which he wanted to rename Germania because he didn't really like Berlin very much, too many communists and socialists there, with vast buildings and huge hall with a dome greater than St. Peter's, triumphal arch bigger than the Arc de Triomphe, and so on.
Ever since he took power in 1933, Hitler dreams of totally rebuilding Berlin no matter what the cost. At its heart would be one of the largest buildings ever built.
Hitler was a sucker for anything that was big. You know, I'm going to build you the Volkssturm, which is going to sort of, you know, seat 180,000 people. You know, Hitler loves all that stuff.
This enormous temple, based on a sketch by Hitler himself, would have been nearly 300 meters high. Here, the German people would gather to worship Hitler and his successors down the centuries. It would be the heart of the Nazi cult. Germania actually began in 1934. A new sports stadium for 100,000 spectators was created for the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Hitler gave the crucial task of creating the vast new Reich Chancellery, which was 400 meters long, to his favorite architect, Albert Speer. The Chancellery was destroyed in the war, but other elements of Germania still survive in Berlin. This was the huge air ministry. With 2,800 rooms and nearly 7 kilometers of corridors, it was the largest office building in the world. Today, it is the home of the finance ministry. Speer also creates a vast triumphal way leading west from the Brandenburg Gate. He decorates it with a huge 19th century war memorial, the Victory Column, by moving it nearly 2 kilometers. The entrances to the pedestrian tunnels are Speer's own design, as are the street lamps lining the road. An important part of Hitler's plan are new embassies for his allies, including Spain and Italy. They remain in use by their original owners to this day. But the completion of the Japanese embassy marks the end of Germania. The military situation in the east is getting worse, forcing Hitler to put his grandiose building project on hold.
By 1943, Germany is beginning to face a manpower crisis. The loss of a complete army at Stalingrad meant not just the loss of numbers, but a wiping out of a huge chunk of experience and professionalism within the German army at that time. So really, the Germans are looking for technological solutions to compensate for its reduction in manpower and, more importantly, experience.
Hitler was always very enthusiastic about technological progress. And Germany had a tradition of great engineering and of great science. So in the Second World War, the Germans produced some of the most advanced weapons.
The most advanced weapons of all are created and tested here, a top secret base on Germany's Baltic coast, Peenemunde.
Whole Peenemunde facilities, which actually were two armament facilities, one of the Army and one of the Air Force, were of course the biggest armament center in whole Europe during World War II, and was 25 square kilometers wide. Up to 12,000 people worked here. So it was enormous industrial facility which spent lots of resources, material, financial and personal resources.
The mission of the scientists who work here is to develop weapons of enormous speed and power to penetrate the Allies' defenses. By 1944, conventional German bombers have little chance of attacking London successfully. An entirely new approach is needed. So the scientists at Peenemunde create two of the most advanced weapons of the Second World War. The first is a cruise missile, the V-1. With a top speed of 630 kilometers per hour, it is faster than almost every Allied fighter. It carries 850 kilograms of explosive, up to 240 kilometers. The V-2 is an even more extraordinary weapon, the world's first ballistic missile. It carries 1,000 kilograms of explosive, 320 kilometers. Traveling at well over 5,000 kilometers per hour, nothing could detect it or stop it. It arrives at its target without warning. High-tech guidance systems replace increasingly scarce pilots. Now the Nazis believe they have a chance to strike back.
Here was the panacea. There would be this magic weapon that would clear the skies and devastate the landscape to Germany's favour.
On September 29, 1943, Albert Speer promises revenge against the Allied bombing of German cities with a secret weapon. So, before they even exist, the V weapons are a vital tool of Nazi propaganda.
The idea was, in 1944, one of the ways you still got solidarity in the fighting spirit is that you promised the German people that a new generation of miracle weapons would fight the war for them. Firstly, it was anticipatory propaganda. They could tell people that we've got these weapons coming. Then they could actually show them. They seemed formidable.
Any possibility that they can get out of this fix by some miraculous wonder weapon or some reinforcement that was going to come, that the Führer was finally going to conjure, is something people would like to believe in.
During the last 10 months of the war, about 12,000 V1s and 3,500 V2s are launched against Britain and Belgium. Yet the amount of explosives carried by all these expensive weapons is only the same as that dropped by 2 or 3 large Allied bombing raids. By 1944, such raids take place every week. And many V weapons never reach their target. The British work out how to shoot V1s down, destroying more than 4,000 in the air. And even the apparently invincible V2 has serious flaws.
So like 1/3 of the rockets exploded in the air because they had aerodynamic problems, and 3,000 launched rockets, just about 2,000 of them really hit the ground. And also these 2,000 didn't hit exactly because the control system wasn't very exact. It has a radius of 15 kilometers.
The inaccuracy of the V2 is its biggest weakness.
They were technologically very advanced weapons, but in reality their effects were rather limited. So using them at point weapons against specific targets, the V2 was a failure. For instance, the Germans launched several V2s against the port facilities of Antwerpen in autumn and winter 1944-45, or also tried to destroy the bridge at Remagen in 1945. In both cases, the V2 could not destroy their target.
So instead, most are aimed at large cities, especially London and Antwerp, targeting their civilian populations.
It was a terror weapon. It was to terrorize the civilian population in, for example, London, because they came down at any time of the day, at any moment, absolutely without any possibility to hide, without seeing, hearing them come. And this is this terror effect.
More than 12,000 British civilians are killed by Hitler's terror weapons, and their propaganda effect is even greater.
They could tell the German army that it's causing panic, mass panic on the streets of London. People are leaving the cities in droves.
I believe that the Germans, particularly at the political top, were starting to believe their own propaganda and feeling that this would be the panacea to their problems. They're on the defensive, but they could get the Allies probably to bend to their will by being faced with new and terrible weapon types.
But the reality is rather different. In Germany, more civilians are killed by Allied bombing every month than by all the V weapons. And they're expensive. V2s especially use up a lot of scarce materials and need many skilled workers to assemble. Most are slave laborers working in appalling conditions. In fact, more civilians die making V2s than are actually blown up by them. The V weapons are a final, desperate attempt to use technology to overcome Germany's economic weakness.
England, United States, Soviet Union, the biggest economies in the world, of course have more I mean, so the only chance is that we have better, newer technology, a kind of progress as a hope of salvation.
But even the Nazi elite are realizing that the chances of German salvation are getting slimmer and slimmer.
The V stood for Vergeltung, which means retribution. And so these weapons were meant to pay back the Brits for what they'd been doing to Germany. They weren't advertised as being sources of victory. That was completely pushed to one side. It's just getting their own back. And so in a way, the promise of a wonder weapon is also a confession of defeat.
Summer 1944 is a time of the huge disasters for the Germans. In Normandy, the Allied landing had succeeded, and major German forces were encircled and destroyed in the Battle of Falaise. On the Eastern Front, Army Group Center had collapsed, and the Allied air campaign was now beginning to start as a full success. The Allies had now full air supremacy over the skies in Germany.
These hammer blows completely change Hitler's behavior.
Hitler can't really deal with defeat. He doesn't really want to know about it. And so increasingly he refuses to appear in public. He's of course afraid that he might be shouted at or jeered. His appearances are less and less frequent. Towards the very end, he does pretty well vanish. Indeed, his speeches are delivered over the radio by someone else. So he does become more and more of a recluse.
For Goebbels, this is a disaster. Hitler is his greatest propaganda weapon, but with the Führer now almost invisible, he must come up with ever more creative alternatives.
During the war itself, they went much more for pure entertainment, and they still made films which were propaganda, but they were big-budget epics, costume drama, where the propaganda message was heavily disguised beneath an 18th century uniform or a 19th century crinoline skirt.
And the biggest of Goebbels' box office spectaculars is the feature film Kolberg.
Well, in the later stages of the war, Goebbels tried to convince people to hold out against the enemy by spending huge amounts of money and resources on making a film about Kolberg, which is a town in the eastern part of Germany, which had been besieged by Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. And it's all a story in glorious colour, enormous resources devoted to it. Parts of the German army are actually diverted from fighting to put on Napoleonic-era uniforms and take part in the film. And the idea is to show how the townspeople rallied round and defeated the enemy, and that's what the Germans should do.
Well, Kolberg was an extraordinary phenomenon. The producer actually claims that he pulled back 100,000 troops from the front line, about the size, I think, of the current British Army, to act as extras in Kolberg. Certainly the scenes are amazing, the cavalry sweeps and so forth. It's probably more likely to have been about 20,000, but that's still a huge number of troops to pull back for the front in the last stages of the Second World War.
Kolberg is the most expensive Nazi movie. Filming lasted nearly 10 months, both on location and at the Babelsberg Film Studios. While based on real events, the film claims that the will of the citizens to defend their city is strengthened by the imposition of a dynamic new general, a kind of 19th century Nazi. But by the time the fictional version is ready for release in January 1945, the real city is under threat from the advancing Soviet forces.
Then what happens is that the town of Kolberg is surrounded by the Russians, parallel to this. And so what Goebbels did is replace the older general with a thrusting new general, just like in the film. But then Kolberg surrenders, and Goebbels stifles the news of that surrender so that everything will be consistent with the movie. So it's an extraordinary example of art and life not only imitating each other, but being inextricably intertwined.
In January 1945, the German Reich was on the brink of collapse. On the Western Front, the last major German offensive in the Ardennes, in the Battle of the Bulge, had just failed. On the Eastern Front, in mid-January 1945, the Red Army launched a major offensive from the Vistula and is moving towards Berlin. And with the air war is totally lost for the Germans, and Allied bombing now heavily impacted on German industrial production.
The wonder weapons are not appearing in nearly enough numbers to turn the tide. Production of conventional weapons is also falling. And yet the German army holds together, fighting to the very last, despite enormous casualties.
Half of all of Germany's casualties, of all of Germany's dead in the Second World War, occurred in the last 10 months of the war. The Wehrmacht, in January of 1945, lost 450,000 men. This is 3 times as many as 2 years before, in January 1943, that is the month of Stalingrad. I mean, this is a bloodbath without parallel in European and perhaps in human history.
With their enemies now threatening Germany itself, the Nazis might have been expected to withdraw to their country's borders, but Hitler will not allow any retreat.
Hitler often described himself as an all-or-nothing man. He said, when I bet, I go for broke. And he believed very much in the triumph, the power of the will, as the film says. Willpower could conquer anything. So he saw retreat, even tactical withdrawal of such that the generals had all been trained to do in their military schools. Tactical withdrawal was a sign of cowardice.
To keep the armed forces fighting, the Nazis resort to their oldest tactic, repression.
It's kept together, they kept fighting, partly because of increased terror. So there were increasing numbers of executions for deserting the colours, for cowardice, and similar offences. Thousands and thousands of German troops were executed in the last stages of the war for these things.
It's estimated that German courts-martial tried 3 million cases during the war. They sentenced 30,000 members of the German armed forces to death.
The Nazi leadership and the senior German generals shared one big trauma: the defeat of 1918, when it was considered that the morale of the German army had collapsed. So it was considered the German Imperial Army was too soft. This should not repeat. And this is why they imposed harsh, brutal, murderous measures, very often in order to keep up the discipline in the Second World War. Up to 15,000 men were executed after having been court-martialed for various true or alleged crimes like desertion and so forth and so on. And German soldiers were hence coerced to fight until the very last days of the war.
But it's not just the military that are terrorized. Civilians also face extreme punishments.
If one proceeds from the assumption that Germany was not defeated in the battlefield in the First World War, but lost because morale cracked, because the population didn't support the war, didn't have the backbone to continue the fight to the bitter end, then the logical policy to follow is to force them to do it this time and to make sure that there's no backsliding. And this is the motivation for the application of terror against one's own population.
They used an awful lot of coercion. A lot of people were fairly randomly executed by the Gestapo and the SS, and in the final days left even hanging from lampposts. But another part is the power of the propaganda. Right to the bitter end, a lot, you see, continues to function in Berlin. The newspapers continue to be printed when the Russians are in the suburbs. There is even a story told about how one Russian commander picked up a telephone in Berlin and rang Goebbels and told him, blasted him with exactly what he thought of him. The point being that the telephone system was still functioning. So it was still a functioning system, including still a functioning propaganda system.
Particularly on the Eastern Front, they felt that they needed to protect Germany against the Bolshevik hordes as they saw them. And of course, there's a lot of fear of the Red Army, what they would do to civilians, probably mostly justified fear.
Certainly, the notion of fighting to the death was linked to the fact that German soldiers had wreaked havoc on Soviet soil, and they had raped and plundered as they went about their warring, and German soldiers knew that that was going to happen to their wives and children if the Russians got to German soil.
And what's the alternative? To give up? To sue for armistice? After what they've done, that simply isn't going to be possible. So they, because of the position in which they've put themselves, have no choice but to fight on. And also because of the Allied policy of unconditional surrender. This also gives the Germans a strong motivation to keep fighting, and finally to keep fighting to the very bitter end.
When the Nazis, in their desperation, call up the very last remaining German men as a militia to defend the homeland, about all they can give them is a fancy name: the People's Storm.
It was this idea of popular vengeance. Actually, it was Dad's army. And unfortunately, try as you might with the propaganda, you couldn't disguise how young or how old these men were, or the flash of vacancy or weariness. But it was this idea that the army has failed us, the general has failed us, but the people won't. You can call the people to arms and they will fight like demons to defend the Reich. So you have that great rally of the Volkssturm, which Goebbels creates in Berlin, the Greater Berlin Volkssturm, which Goebbels turns into one of the final and greatest propaganda events of the Third Reich.
If one takes a look at what these young people who then get forced into SS units, teenagers, or if one takes a look at the contribution of older men who get drafted into the Volkssturm, this people's militia, what they actually do in terms of military action is at best useless.
And yet the people's faith in Hitler himself does not collapse.
Even though the Nazi regime was often heavily criticised, often Germans would express that if Hitler only knew about it, he would do something about it. So the figure of Hitler as kind of different and distinct and the saviour of Germany sort of lasted quite a long time, even despite the circumstances.
As the end comes ever closer, Hitler veers between fantasy and fatalism.
In the later stages of the war, it becomes a fantasy world for Hitler. He is having military consultations, moving around on a map, armies that really no longer exist.
By now, he distrusts almost all his generals.
In 1945, it was obvious that Germany had totally lost the war. However, there were still some generals which often sent out more optimistic messages. Chief example for that is Field Marshal Schörner, or General Schörner, a convinced Nazi who quickly rose from a lieutenant colonel at the start of the war to a field marshal by the end of the war. So Schörner was someone Himmler or also Goebbels always listened to. Himmler and Goebbels were often demoralized by the situation, and then they saw Schörner, and Schörner was saying, everything, it's not too bad here, there's still a chance, I've just warded off the Soviets, and I'm very positive that in the next couple of days I can launch another offensive, a local offensive, if it's only a local offensive. This was something that Himmler and Goebbels and Hitler wanted to hear in this situation, but it didn't reflect reality.
Schörner's absurd optimism receives its final hollow reward. On 4th of April 1945, Hitler promotes him to Field Marshal. He is the last Nazi military leader of Germany's armed forces. Deep within his bunker, Hitler still finds some time to dream.
So he spends a lot of time thinking about looking at his great architectural plans, projects that he wanted to do after the war.
He spends time with his friend and architect Albert Speer, playing around with ideas of what Germania would be like. And he also liked to play around with ideas for recreating Linz in Austria, which is his hometown, as a kind of German Florence.
Hitler idealizes Linz. For him, it is the perfect small German town. This is where he lived as a boy with his mother.
He was going to have an art museum there, and in fact, while Hermann Göring looted art for his own private house, Hitler collected art and stole art to put up in this new Museum of German Art. And he also wanted it to be a center for German music.
But as well as these fantastical dreams, Hitler is also planning a final and very real nightmare for the German people.
Hitler began to feel that the German people were not worthy of him. They'd let him down. Or they had shown in the Darwinian struggle for the survival of the fittest against other races, they'd shown that they were the weakest race. And so he issued this infamous Nero order after the Roman emperor, who said, "Let Rome burn," that everything should be destroyed in the path of the oncoming armies. All the facilities should be destroyed, public utilities, factories, the basic necessities of life.
It is a mistake to believe that undestroyed or only temporarily paralyzed industrial and supply installations will be useful to us again after the recapture of lost territories. I therefore command all military traffic, communications, industrial and supply installations, as well as objects within Reich territory that might be used by the enemy in the continuation of his fight, either now or later, are to be destroyed. It would be a final historic example of national self-sacrifice.
This time we're going to go down with honor. This time we're going to go down in flames. This time we're going to fight to the end. We're going to fight to the end to make a shining example for future generations who will then want to pick up the torch and start again.
Albert Speer is horrified by the Nero Decree. He claims he does everything he can to frustrate it, despite fanatical Nazis enthusiastically putting the plan into action. But in the end, it is the Allied advance that frustrates Hitler's apocalyptic vision. 20th of April 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. Since he seized power in 1933, this day has been a major national holiday in Nazi Germany. In the past, the streets would be decorated. There would be celebrations, speeches, songs, and poems. The military would parade and oaths of loyalty sworn. This year is very different. Soviet forces are closing on Berlin. Hitler last appeared in public a few weeks earlier, congratulating a small group of Hitler youth on their brave defense of the city. This is his final weapon. Boys as young as 12. Now back in his bunker, the Allies have arranged a final birthday present for him. A massive artillery bombardment and a bombing raid. The final Soviet assault on Berlin has begun. And yet the Nazi system continues to function.
I spoke to a German panzer commander who was awarded the Knight's Cross in the final months of the war, and he received his Knight's Cross on the last day of the war. A German dispatch rider had driven through all the rubble of the town that he was defending and got off his motorbike and handed him the certificates and his medal, the Knight's Cross. So right up until the end, the system is still working.
It's blatantly, patently obvious that Germany is going to lose the war. Hitler is completely aware of this. Then what is the point of continuing? And they do continue. And this is a truly remarkable chapter in German, European human history. I mean, these people don't stop fighting even when the Russians are in the garden of the Reich Chancellery.
On April 29th, Soviet troops cross here at the Moltke Bridge. Their target is the Reichstag, the symbol of German power. The next day, finally succumbing to reality, Hitler commits suicide. He is not the last Nazi to do so.
At the end of the war, there's an enormous wave of suicides. Many generals, ministers, regional leaders, high Nazi officials quite an extraordinary wave of suicides.
Himmler, Bormann and Field Marshal Model are just a few of the senior Nazis and generals who kill themselves. Goebbels, the man more responsible than anyone for creating the Hitler myth, is appointed Chancellor of Germany. His only act is to ask the Soviet forces for a ceasefire. They refuse. Goebbels then carries out his final appalling act.
His wife and he then murdered their children by poison because, as his wife said to her son by an earlier marriage, adult son, in a letter, she could not think that life would be worth living after the fall of the Third Reich, and she didn't want to subject her children to this. It was an absolutely terrible act of ideological vindictiveness, really. And Goebbels and his wife then killed themselves.
From their foundation, the Nazis always said they will lead Germany to world domination. But it was always a fundamentally flawed plan. All it has led to is destruction. Germany is now in ruins. Project Nazi is over.